Hi. In this episode, we'll talk about the huge increase in launch rates that has been occurring across the world. We'll also talk a little bit about NASA's Martian sample return system and a recent announcement that they made regarding that, as well as SpaceX's changing role as part of the Artemis mission. Hello, and welcome to the Undiscovered Country. I'm your host, Bryant A.M. Baker. Today, I'll be presenting the top 5 most important things happening in the world of space. I'm glad you're here. Let's jump right into it. It was announced today that the world has exceeded the total launches that were accomplished for the year 2020 for the year 2021 already in the year 2022. The 3 successful orbital launch attempts raised the number to 147 for this year. There have been 141 successful launches, 5 failures, and a partial failure. Now, in 2021, there were only 146 launch attempts with 135 successes, 10 failures, and 1 partial failure. So this is a huge deal. We're making incredible strides forward in the number of launches that are happening. Now, of those launches, it was announced that 68 of the successes, 2 partial failures and 1 total failure, came from the United States, as a total of 48.3% of the world total. In addition to that, China launched 46 rockets successfully, with 1 partial failure, accounting for 32% of the world total. And Russia launched 19 successes for 12.9% of the world total. Now, as the global launch rate increases, as well as reliance on space, the big question that becomes is, what's going to happen to the orbital environment? What is this doing on Earth's environment? These questions are going to become ever more important as time goes by. And only with time will we really be able to have answers to these questions moving forward. Next, let's talk about the Artemis program and SpaceX's involvement in that program. NASA has restored plans to include a lunar landing on its Artemis 4 mission to the moon later this decade, months after saying that it wouldn't include a lunar lander in Artemis 4 after the first successful landing in Artemis 3. Apparently, they've decided to change plans. Mr. Mark Karasich, the Deputy Associate Administrator for Artemis campaign development at NASA, confirmed that NASA had decided to include a landing in Artemis 4 again, despite the earlier plans. The mission would likely use what's called the Option B version of SpaceX's Starship lander. They made this announcement stating that they would go with Option B as part of their human landing system contract with SpaceX, which originally covered an Option A lander that SpaceX will demonstrate on the Artemis 3 mission. But they're going with Option B because it would make changes to the Starship lander to support a more ambitious missions, both in the near term as well as in the long term, particularly with regards to the sustainable phase of Artemis. NASA is projecting that Artemis 4 will be launching in 2027, and originally they were saying that that date would not include a lander. Of course, now it will. That same schedule expects that Artemis 3 would launch to the moon and land on the moon in 2025. Only time will tell whether the most recent delays, both in SLS as well as in the development of Starship, will actually bring fruit to that kind of a timeline. But we're hoping moving forward that things will be possible, because the idea of us being that close to returning to the moon is absolutely tantalizing, and I personally am looking forward to it. Next, let's turn our attention over to a recent opinion piece that was put into The Hill by Mr. Mark R. Whittington that I thought was incredibly interesting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on. The author and blogger opined that, quote, "It's time for the United States to use the power of Starlink to deliver space-based information to anywhere in the Earth and to extend that use to its reach in Russia," unquote. Now, when I first read this, I was really surprised. I was like, what is he talking about here? What do you mean provide services to Russia, especially in the current time of what's going on? But what he's referring to is using Starlink as a means of opening up information to the Russian people to help it be better understood what it is that their government and their leadership is actually doing, both with regards to hurting them as a people, as well as what they're doing to hurt the world at large. Now, he points out the fact that this isn't all that different than campaigns that were undertaken during the Reagan administration, in which the United States used short-form radio to try to pump in information into the Soviet Union, again, to let them know of what was going on in the rest of the world. We've seen similar things happening with trying to get information into North Korea. But the idea here would be to, in an organized fashion, send in capabilities of connecting with Starlink to be able to bring information that would be, of course, damning to what is being done by Russian leadership to the Russian people themselves. Now, the questions that come up in my mind is, how would this be received? Is this the modern day invasion? Is this going to be taking, is information eventually going to take the place of armed attacks? Is this the new type of warfare? I think in many ways it already has become, but the idea of actively, to use a somewhat inflammatory word, invade another country with the ability to access information that that country actively does not want them to be able to access, is a very intriguing prospect, but also a scary one, depending on what that will eventually be interpreted as in the future. Mr. Whittington remarks at the end of his essay, he says, quote, "Many people thought that the end of the Cold War meant that tyranny and oppression, at least on the part of great powers, had also ended. However, the United States and its allies find themselves involved in another long, twilight struggle with new tyrants who grind down their people for their own gain. Information warfare, bringing the raw, unvarnished truth to people who live under the boot of tyranny, is one way of waging that struggle. Thanks to Mr. Musk," meaning Elon Musk, "the world has access to Starlink, which could prove a potent weapon in a new Cold War," unquote. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this type of proposal. Next, let's move on to the Space Force. The first chief of the U.S. Space Force, General John J. Raymond, announced that on November 2nd, he will relinquish command to General B. Chance Saltzman, who will retire after 38 years of military service. Now, famously, General Raymond was the first commander-in-chief of the Space Force. Before that, he was the commander of U.S. Space Command when it was reestablished in 2019. A huge amount of responsibility in what has become the new space response for the United States military. As the first official member of the new service, Raymond had to start building it from the ground up, transferring people and funding from the Air Force's space units. And amidst all this, he had to navigate a charged political landscape, as the Space Force in its early days was viewed as a vanity project of former President Trump, and was even parodied in Netflix famously. Obviously, with this being created by the previous administration, it was assumed by a lot of people, it was predicted by a lot of people, that when President Biden took over, that he would reverse course and gut the Space Force, end the Space Force, sabotage the Space Force in whatever way. But somewhat surprisingly to many, the administration gave the full support to the Space Force, and over the last 2 years has actually boosted the service's budget, even amid concerns that U.S. satellites have become military targets and have addressed the need to be better defended. Now, General Raymond, when talking about the size of the Space Force, one thing that has received a lot of criticism during his tenure, stated that over the last handful of years, the department has prioritized space, and there has been an increase in our budgets. Going forward, he stated that we just need to be able to articulate what it is that we need and have the analytical rigor that says, here's why we need it. Now, this turnover makes the end of the first administration of the Space Force, and General Raymond's successor, General Saltzman, will have the unenviable task of answering many of these questions. Okay, how big does this organization need to be? How big should it be in order to accomplish its ever increasingly important mission? And we look forward to seeing how he answers that question in the near future. Finally, we'll turn our attention to a little bit deeper space. NASA and the European Space Agency, ESA, have come to an agreement about where samples of the Martian surface that have been collected by Perseverance will be picked up for return to the Earth. They signed an agreement on October 19th, which agreed that the depot or the cache will be a place called Three Forks, which is an area located near the base of an ancient river delta in the Jezero crater, where Perseverance has been wandering around picking up these samples. 10 tubes of these samples will be placed in the area to be able to be picked up in the near future. Now, scientists believe that the core samples from the delta's fine-grained sedimentary rocks deposited in a lake, billions of years ago, are the most likely to contain indicators of whether microbial life existed when the Mars's climate was much different than it was today. Mr. Thomas Zurbuchen, the Associate Administrator of NASA headquarters in Washington, I'm probably butchering his name there, but he said, quote, "Never before has a scientifically curated collection of samples from another planet been collected and placed for return on Earth," unquote. He said, NASA and ESA have reviewed the proposed site and the Mars samples that will be deployed for this cache as soon as next month. When that first tube is positioned on the surface, it will be a historic moment in space exploration, unquote. However, obviously, even after these samples are deposited in the place where they will be picked up, there is, of course, always the hurdle of them actually needing to be picked up. So there are many steps left in this process. But this is a huge step forward. And you don't have to use much of an imagination to realize that as soon as this step is done successfully, the depositing and the picking up and the returning of samples to the Earth, what an incredible step forward that will be for eventual crewed vessels leaving Earth orbit and getting into Martian orbit and landing on the surface of Mars. What an exciting prospect that will be. I'm personally really stoked and excited for that day to come. Thanks for joining me. Links for all of these stories are going to be in the description. The world of space law, policy, and business is changing every day. If you missed what happened yesterday, be sure to check out the video I did covering it. I'd love to hear your thoughts and everything I talked about, and I'll see you again next time.